Hello and welcome to the Author Talks webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Arts in Writing, the Master of Art in Science Writing, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Evan James on his book, Cheer Up, Mr. Widdicombe, and his book of essays, I've Been Wrong Before. My name is Natalie Koss, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Author Talks playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Karen Hooper, the program director of the Master of Arts in Writing program.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first author talk of the spring semester. My name is Karen Hooper. I'm the director of the MA in Writing program, and we're bringing you these monthly author talks in conjunction with our sister program, the Science Writing program. Tonight, our moderator will be Jess Johnson, who is a student in the MA in Writing program, and she will be talking and introducing Evan James. So thank you very much for coming. And again, put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to them in the second half of the evening.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with Evan. We're going to jump right in. As has already been explained, please put your questions in. We'll make time for those at the end. I am thrilled to introduce Evan James. He's a graduate of the University of Iowa, and he's been published in the Oxford American, Travel and Leisure, the Iowa Review, the Paris Review, the Sun, and the New York Observer, to name just a few. He's been recognized for numerous awards and fellowships from MacDowell, Yaddo, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Carson McCuller Center, the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, and the Lamba Literary Writers Retreat, where he was named the 2017 Emerging LGBTQ Voice Fellow. He's a seasoned instructor and is taught at the University of Iowa, the Iowa Young Writers Studio, Victoria University of Wellington, New School, and the Prairie Point School in Westport, where he actually established the school's creative writing program. And we were so fortunate that now he's part of us. So he is a multifaceted writer, writing both fiction and creative nonfiction. So tonight we are going to have the pleasure to explore both of those with a discussion framed around his debut novel, Cheer Up, Mr. Widdicombe, which you saw on the screen, and then, of course, his collection of essays, I've Been Wrong Before. In just a moment, I'm going to invite Evan to kick things off by reading a short passage from Cheer Up, Mr. Widdicombe, but let me try to kind of set it up for you guys if you haven't had the chance to read it yet. This is a work of comedic fiction. This piece follows 7 different characters as they summer at Willowbrook Manor, the Widdicombe's new home on Bay Bridge Island. They are an upper middle class family that is focused on manners and maintaining excellence. The Widdicombe and their house guests and gardener would appear to have it all. But as Evan dives deep into their minds, he exposes rippling, skittering thoughts that trip into dramatic ponderings and absurdities as they grapple with their sense of self and identity and purpose in the world. Satire at its best, I found myself chuckling at their self-fabricated shenanigans and often stunned when amongst their frenetic thoughts, they hit upon something profound. At this point, Evan, if you want to say hi and read us a bit of your book.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jess. Thank you for that really beautiful description of the book. You captured it so well. And I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. Also very excited this year to be joining the MA in Writing and teaching. So happy to be here and part of this writing community. And looking forward to talking tonight and sharing a little bit of my work. So yeah, I'm going to read a passage from the novel Cheer Up, Mr. Widdicombe, which is in a state of blurry distortion. And this is a passage toward the end of the book, actually. And it's fairly focused on a character named Michelle Bigsby, who, as Jess was describing, the novel concerns this core handful of characters in a house on Bainbridge Island, Washington, during one summer, and they're pursuing all manner of kind of creative projects and doomed romantic affairs and other whimsies and fancies. Michelle is a character who's come in to kind of tend to this eccentric family. She assists them in ways that are at times comically ambiguous or maddeningly ambiguous for her. So anything else I should mention before I read this scene? I think I'll just dive right in. Or I'll tell you a little bit about some of these characters, actually. Carol Widdicombe is kind of the matriarch of the family. Frank is her husband. Christopher is their son, who's returned home from sort of a difficult semester at art school, and he hurts his hand during the book, and he's kind of lounging around and complaining a lot. Michelle, and then this character, kind of a side character named Jens, who's from Denmark, a friend of Christopher's a friend of Michelle's from a time when she studied abroad, and they're kind of like thick as thieves and cutting Christopher out of the conversation in this scene. So, Carol, her regal hair slightly mussed from her nap, came in to say they should help themselves to tea and things in the kitchen, which they did, returning with cups of Assam variously whitened and plates of triangular sandwiches, egg and watercress, cucumber. The children were supposed to pick up some sweet things, she said, settling in. She had taken to calling Christopher, Michelle, and Jens the children. God knows where they've run off to. We'll let them be young, said Gracie. She blew on her tea. There will be hell to pay if I don't taste a scone today, said Frank. Fortunately for the younger generation, they arrived mere minutes later. Christopher led the charge, entering the room with a long-suffering look on his face. They simply refuse to speak English, he cried. Christopher, said Carol, holding a sandwich triangle in the air. That's not a very nice thing to say about anyone. Michelle and Jens have been intentionally excluding and alienating me all day by speaking Danish, said Christopher, throwing himself onto the gray sofa with a growl. The polyglots in question entered the room then, performing a private conversation with wide, sparkling eyes. They held brown bakery bags in their hands. You see, said Christopher. He cast his gaze upon the tea snacks. My demoralization is complete. You had better start learning now, said Frank, nodding in Jan's general direction, or your husband will forever have the upper hand. As I've told you before, marriage is a state of never-ending psychological warfare. I forgot to mention Christopher has fallen in love with Jan. Carol scoffed. She threw a piece of bread at her husband. Don't mind him, she said to Jans, who looked somewhat uncomfortable. His relatively reserved manner stood out among the Widdicombe's and their friends. Michelle said something to him in Danish, and then they both laughed. I, for one, find it refreshing to have a foreign tongue in the house, Carol continued. Thank you, said Jans. I'm writing that down, said Christopher, then burning it. Carol sighed. We're so blinkered here in America. Is marijuana legal in Denmark, Jans? Frank asked. Marijuana, said Jans, who was being pulled by Michelle toward the kitchen. No, though it is tolerated. Here it's legal for medicinal purposes, said Frank. He looked around the room at those gathered. I think it may be high time I got a prescription. Christopher gave his father a sad look. It might help with your pain, he said, but what about ours? Michelle and Jans poured tea for themselves and for Christopher in the kitchen and arranged scones and cakes on a platter. They had, it was true, been tormenting Christopher all day by speaking to each other in Danish. Michelle's was rusty, but still serviceable enough to sustain this game. It only seemed fair to take Christopher down a notch every now and again, given how well he had it. Oh, sure, he could tell them that their exclusion of him compounded his, quote, already profound sense of otherness. He could respond to them with a dramatic monologue about how their flaunting of their friendship only reminded him how truly friendless his own life had been. and how, under the circumstances, he should not be the one feeling like a third wheel for the umpteenth time. She felt for him, she really did. At the same time, she wished he would cheer up a little. He complained a lot for someone who appeared to be surrounded by so much good, and who had gone some way toward creating an already remarkable life for himself. Even thinking this, she imagined how he might take issue with the word remarkable, break it down into a curse somehow, turn being merely remarked upon into evidence of an inescapably sorrowful fate. It's funny, she thought, the way we internalize one another, become, for a time at least, the means through which we think about life. This must be part of what it meant to know someone. And then there would be the part that relied not on thinking, but on seeing, on hearing. Returning to the others, she saw that Jans had taken a seat next to Christopher. There was room for her too, but at the edge of the gathered group she paused, arrested by a feeling of absence. In comparable moments that summer, Bradford had often sat among them, gesturing as he matched wits with the Widdicombe's, seducing them with his charm. Startling, but she had briefly forgotten him. What had it been like to be him, sitting there that morning months ago, watching her, saying the words most adolphinately? Why should it cause her a jolt of fear now, standing by the circular green sofa, to feel that she would never really be sure? Everything okay over there? That was Carol speaking to her. Yes, she said. I was just admiring the room. I've said it before, but I love this room so much. It really is the perfect room, said Gracie. Carol beamed. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you for reading us in. I think that one of the things that I enjoyed the most about your book, well, there was actually three things, but let's just concentrate on one, is how you take these almost really mundane moments where not much is actually happening in the scene and allow your characters to just ripple through thoughts like dominoes. They connect one thing to the next thing, and pretty much it's not just about wanting to have a scone or tea or being excluded from a conversation. It's about being remarkable in life. And how when you were approaching this book, did you pick those moments for your characters? Like, did you assign them? Did you find them? Can you talk a little bit about that character development in those fulcrum spots?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I think I'm such a process-bound writer that nearly everything emerges in an unexpected exploratory way from one draft to the next to the next to the next to the next. So there's a lot of exploratory drafting, and it was, I think, part of a process for me too, while I was writing this, of just looking for possibilities to delight in and dwell on really small things to kind of an absurd comic length. I think at some point, actually, I started to understand while working on this book, because I'd begun it with the intention of writing a comic novel, and was reading a lot of comic novels, that smaller and smaller, the smaller and more specific something is, often the funnier it is. And so I found myself with this cast of half a dozen characters, kind of, moving them around through different scenarios and rooms. And I was interested not only in kind of having them be in a sparkling scene with lots of dialogue and little repartee and funny moments and whatnot, but in what was happening in their interiors in a moment of stillness. And I think for me, it was a way of finding kind of a comedic way into writing interiority. And so it made sense to have a character kind of obsessing about a nose hair for 2 or 3 pages or something like that, or having a lengthy argument about other people excluding him by speaking Danish. And I found too that the comedy and the effects and the just the texture of the characters was so much more specific. If I spent more time, yeah, dwelling on a detail like that.
I kind of hear that as like you take like the stakes are low for them, but they find a way to just make it the most extreme, like mental, uh, existential crisis really that is possible. Well, you have like you're navigating all these in territory, like inner monologues and rating 7 different characters. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of characters for a book. Like how did you populate? How did you come up with, oh, I need 7 and this will be how the story arcs, especially when we stay inside of each, we shift from each mind to mind to mind.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's another really process-oriented thing for me, and it spotlights something that I've learned about myself as a fiction writer, which is when it comes to characters, I'm just a proliferator. Like I'll always come up with a new character to bounce another character off of, so I can learn more. Let's say I've come up with character A. If I have character A and B, I can learn a pretty good amount about character A, but if I have him bouncing off character B and character C and character D, and they're all really distinct, they all have a really distinct perspective or worldview, I find it helps me learn about every character in a kind of more a richer way, to kind of bounce them off each other in that way. I had to do a certain amount of work, and I find this is just a tendency I have as a writer in the drafting process. I always end up with way too many characters, and I take every character really seriously, and I want to know everything about them. And at some point, you know, I saw, okay, I have 7 characters, and I have a draft where every single one of these characters is getting equal airtime, um, which can be something that is right for certain kinds of novels. For me, I had to spend a decent amount of time and rewriting, figuring out ways to foreground, 4 central characters and take some of those secondary characters and kind of scale them back a little bit. Yeah, so there ends up being a lot of trial and error and experimentation in that way. Though I also find that I'm happier with a secondary character, when I know a whole lot about them, even if it doesn't appear on the page. But it's just a totally, again, just a totally exploratory process. Well, I'll start writing about one person, and 2 or 3 other characters will arrive out of nowhere.
Do you find that like putting them in this house and then even putting them even more on an island and kind of restricting their environment, well, not that they were chained up in there or anything, but do you think that helped keep all of these guys bouncing off each other, as you said, like points of tension and play? Was that a purposeful choice, or did that naturally come about because you had such a high population of characters that you had to keep them together somehow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it did naturally come about. Like my instinct was just to keep them in a container in a way. Though I did recognize that and notice that after a little while and realize it was something that there's a lot of precedence for and kind of like a tradition of in comedic literature. You have all these drawing room comedies. I had been reading a lot of English comedic novels and plays, and many of them take place in these kind of hothouse contained domestic environments. So there was that element. And yeah, there was something about that I think helped me sort out some of the concerns of the book too, because at some point I realized, okay, most of this is going to be taking place in this house. how can I make that as interesting as possible? You know, I have Carol, the mother, embarking on this kind of book length redecoration project where she's constantly bringing in new furniture, trying out new configurations of stuff. So the setting can kind of mutate and change along the way in that sense. But I remember an early reader of the book for me pointed out that it felt kind of play-like, and I think it's that contained setting feeds into that in some way.
I had the opportunity to talk to you a couple weeks ago in preparation for tonight, and one of the things that I still think is shocking to me is you said that the first 30 pages of every story that you write just sort of come all at once to you, and then you take it from there. Can you tell us a little bit about like what sets off that germ for this book in particular, but and then how you knew that was those 30 pages were the ones that were going to be this book?
Yeah, it is mysterious, though. I, I've noticed now, having, you know, I worked on this book for a long time over the course of 10 years or so, on and off. I would take really long breaks, but and have written manuscripts of a couple other novels, and have found this just to be an odd idiosyncrasy of my own, which is that, well, I think what actually happens is it works kind of like this. I do a lot of pre-writing in just a note form, where I'll have a piece of a pad of paper or a document where I just start talking to myself about the book. And so it sounds kind of like, maybe there should be a character that's like this. They'll have this quality and that quality, and then maybe I'll kind of write a brief description of them. And it's totally non-chronological, it's just generative. And it's a way for me, I think, to start inhabiting the sensibility of the book, and to start discovering for myself what some of the concerns are that are on my mind or in my unconscious. And so before I sit down to write any proper pages, I've done a fair amount of that. Like there might be 100 or 200 pages of notes, and I really like that phase a lot. And then I think there's a point at which a vision starts to click for me out of that, and it's not that I understand the whole thing, but I have a good idea of how to like lay the foundation. And so for whatever reason, the next thing that usually happens is I'll write 20 or 30 pages of the beginning, and then overdraft, and many drafts. For some reason, that part has always just remained pretty much the same for me, and it takes me forever to figure out everything else, especially the end. And I know there are some writers who like imagine the end first, and they find themselves working towards it. But this has just emerged as kind of the way that it happens for me.
Do you think that, so in the end of this ended in Michelle's POV, who, like, you start the book actually in Bradford's, her almost romantic partner. So what you're saying is you just ended up on Michelle because she was looking at the room, and the room, just like a play, like you were saying, like the room closed it down, like they had cheered up Mr. Widdicombe and it was over. Is that what you're saying? Like you didn't plan to put her there, or you didn't curate her over there. You just ended there. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's the outcome of a really long process of writing a lot of versions of the book where it's not quite right, or it's on its way to a deeper understanding of what really needs to happen. And I think I'm a writer who likes to be surprised by that process, and is really open to things kind of mutating along the way. Michelle was a character who, and I do think I start with some kind of like character dynamic that is amusing to me. So, you know, at the very beginning, those opening scenes, I did have this idea. What if I have this kind of curmudgeonly guy who everyone is trying to cheer up and make act more optimistic and kind of projecting their own unhappiness onto him. And they're really invested in getting him to stop having a midlife crisis, basically, because it's bothering them. And I thought that that was going to be kind of the central, you know, concern of the book. And then as these other characters started to come in, like Michelle, I thought, well, she's maybe kind of a minor character who is an observer of this family and is really organized and is kind of you know, a straight man, as they might put it in certain comedy circles. And then over time, it emerged that she had a much more important role to play in the story than I realized at first. I think partly because she does have this special position of being an outsider amongst this family, and she's an observer and kind of prides herself on a certain amount of objectivity. And so the longer I worked on it, the more time I spent kind of just dwelling in her inner life and meditating on how did she end up here? How does she feel about these people? Yeah, she took on kind of a greater dimension, and then it started to really, you know, even though it started in this kind of farcical place, it began to matter more to me that she have a little bit of a transformative experience during that summer, or that yeah, she'd have an epiphany of some kind, or yeah, shift of relationship to the situation.
I like that you called her observer. Again, cheated because we got to talk a couple weeks ago. I know that that is the character in the book that you align with more yourself. And this is where we're going to have a little shift and start talking about nonfiction creative writing. You have a start in journalism. You wrote for small local publications for a while, and then kind of grew into writing this way. So observation was definitely what you expressed as something you identified as a core approach to your writing. So it sounds like, could you talk a little bit about what that practice is? You already touched on it a little, that you have a collection of notes. Are they in a vault somewhere? Are they in like crazy scraps of old receipts? And like, what's that process for you, like to collect them, but also how do you activate them? How do you mix them into something that becomes either creative nonfiction writing or like this book?
Yeah, great question. I think that the process feels different to me for fiction and creative nonfiction, or nonfiction generally, let's say, for various reasons. I think one of the things I really enjoy about writing fiction, although this has started to apply to certain nonfiction projects that I'm working on as well, is the sense of how should I put it, being committed to taking as much time as you wish to kind of dwell in the world, and to spend a lot of time understanding what's emerging in your work without feeling a strong pressure to rush to completion. And I think you know, I struggled with that and with the novel in various ways, like anyone. I started it when I was in my late 20s, and there were times when I was like, I just want to get this done. Like the next draft will be the draft. But it turned out there were, you know, 5 drafts after that that made it deeper and deeper. I think one of the differences for me with nonfiction is that I've often worked at a shorter length and kind of more compressed forms, which is odd for me because I have like I find it totally mysterious and difficult to write fictional short stories. It's something I kind of do in private, but I feel I find it very mysterious and I feel very uncertain about it. Um, with nonfiction, there's something about seeing through a shorter piece of writing, seeing it through those phases of kind of dreaming and note taking and drafting and refining more quickly, and polishing something shorter like that, and taking it through the full cycle of writing while you have this longer project in the background, which for me is usually a novel. It's nice to feel like you can see something through from daydream or notion to polished work while you're involved in this really long-term process that feels, uh, you know, often very uncertain. Um, but there is a similar element of process for me where I usually just start by talking to myself on the page, and opening up a file or having a notebook where I'm trying to get in touch with my genuine curiosity about a topic, or notice that an idea or a topic keeps recurring to me, and identifying that and starting to investigate it in a really informal way initially. Um, yeah, so that's a little bit about that.
That's all really helpful. I think sometimes we end up being exposed or noticing something, but not really knowing then what to do. And then, like you're saying, like how it'll evolve. So that's nice to hear from your side. For just a minute, I'm going to read out a couple to set up your collection of essays. So again, for those that have not had a chance to read it, by the way, all of you guys go read both of these as soon as possible. I've Been Wrong Before is a collection of essays that track Evan's own growth as a writer and a creator. Both a metaphysical and literal journey, we follow Evan from his humble professional beginnings at the ticket office of the San Francisco Ballet to far-flung places like the countryside of Indonesia. Along the way, we contemplate the power of relationships and discover new perspective around what is beautiful. Similarly to the characters in Sheriff Mr. Widdicombe, we contemplate who we are and why we are. Evan, do you want to read a little snippet from one of your essays?
I would love to, and thanks for another wonderful summary and description of the work. I want to read the epigraph at the very front of the collection because you alluded to it, and because it speaks to all this really process-driven stuff that I've been describing. And it's a quote from Thomas Bernhard, the Austrian novelist, his book Gargoyles. And the line is, "Aloud, I said, the unforeseen is what is beautiful." And I do think that encapsulates some way how all of these things came to, all these different kinds of pieces emerged for me. Anyway, I'm going to read from an essay called The Land of Sweets, which is about the period of time that I spent working in the ticket office for the San Francisco Ballet. There's a lot of essays in this collection about work, and about having different kinds of jobs, which I've had many, many, many different kinds. And I'll just dive in. So, for a couple of years in my mid-20s, I was the one you called if you wanted to see the San Francisco Ballet perform The Nutcracker. The Nutcracker was the company's annual cash cow. Indeed, it's the cash cow for ballet companies all over America because of its whimsical and family-friendly nature. Unlike The Dying Swan, a short ballet recreating the last moments in the life of a swan, a spectacle no family wants to behold during the holidays. In the phone room at the San Francisco Ballet during Nutcracker season, the lines rang all day long. A flashing red light on the telephone let clerks like me know that even after we'd finished soothing the last frantic mother, another frantic mother awaited us. "What am I going to tell my kids?" one of those mothers once said to me in the tone she probably used when arguing with her husband. She had 5 kids and would not accept the idea that I could only seat them apart from one another. Given the scant number of remaining tickets, I would have to scatter them around the highest balcony. Some people say you can hear the music better there, I said. She scoffed. Who wants to hear the Nutcracker? I wish she had then added, the Nutcracker should be seen, not heard, but that was expecting too much. We've gone to the Nutcracker every year, she said. It's a Christmas tradition. What am I going to tell them? Sorry, kids, no Nutcracker this year? No Christmas? If only I had one of those signs up in my cubicle that read, your failure to plan does not constitute an emergency for me, or one that read, stop, just stop. If this frantic mother had really been bringing her children to see the Nutcracker for years, she would have known by now that after the subscribers had their pick of seats, the public rushed in like crazed ants toward a mountain of sugar. It's strained belief that every year more people wanted to see the Nutcracker than were actually able to. There were dozens of performances. The War Memorial Opera House had 3,000 seats. But one learns patience working any job that depends upon the hysteria of crowds for its existence. This patience stopped me from saying, oh, come on, let your kids sit by themselves. Sitting apart from you could be a whole new Christmas tradition. My coworker David, a large, soft-spoken man with one glittering stud earring, would sometimes intone the ballet's iconic refrain between calls. Dun, 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 dun. We would all moan and writhe in our cubicles. This melody, heard every time we put someone on hold, had become a kind of Pavlovian hell keen. The devil would undoubtedly hum it while flaying us alive in our internal damnation. Aside from David, the phone room could be divided into 2 groups, the irreverent young and the old-timers. All of us young still had doe-eyed hope to spare, dreams of becoming envied fashion designers, writers, virtuous social workers. I often worked alongside an optimistic young woman named Katrina. Katrina had her sights set on a more specialized career too, but it was something very practical, nursing maybe, or accounting. Whatever it was held no candle to her more immediate and urgent desire to visit Disneyland. She adored the songs and characters of Disney and would, after she found out I was gay, sometimes ask me questions like, Evan, which Disney princess is your favorite? You are, Katrina, I would say. You're my favorite Disney princess. Correct answer, she would say, and then we'd laugh. Until, that is, I recovered myself and said, did you know that Walt Disney suffered from debilitating panic attacks? It must have been hard work being Walt Disney, she said. Stressful. He was consumed by fear and anxiety, I said. A workaholic, obsessively constructing a fantasy world in order to mask his all-consuming dread. Poor Walt, said Katrina. Then she began to sing Part of Your World from The Little Mermaid. Toward the end of Nutcracker season, my job consisted simply of denying my callers anything whatsoever. No empty seats remained. Changing from one performance to another was impossible. And so I would sit during the evening shift in a small room off one of the somber hallways in the opera house. Often it was just me and Katrina, who would softly sing songs from Aladdin or The Lion King between calls, saying, no, I'm afraid not. I'm sorry, but, and no. An unusual moment from my not inconsiderable time in the service industry. After so many years spent accommodating people, there's something satisfying about being, for a little while at least, unable to help anyone for a living.
There's so much about that I feel like I have lived and resemble. So thank you for sharing that. As you guys have probably heard from this excerpt from the last, Evan has a very distinct comedic voice, which he's discussed. Can you unpack that a little for us? I mean, did you fall into comedy? Is that your internal voice? Is it funny like that inside your mind all the time, or do you work to tease out those moments?
I wish. It's so much more dreadful inside my mind than it is all craft. No, I did come to it through reading. I mean, I always enjoyed comedy, and I was raised by someone who was really obsessed with the screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s, which I really love too. And they're full of really zippy dialogue, and they're incredibly hilarious. Movies like Bringing Up Baby and His Girl Friday and that kind of thing. So I always appreciated and liked comedy. When I started writing for newspapers, didn't know very much about this kind of tradition of comedic newspaper writing or essay writing. And I found my way into that just through like a used book fair where I found a copy of a book by S.J. Perlman, who was one of this group of writers for the New Yorker I want to say in the 30s, 40s, 50s, him and Dorothy Parker and James Thurber and others. And to me, it was just so surprising and such a revelation to read that kind of work, because it had such a distinct voice. Each one of these writers had a really cultivated, distinct comedic style, and it was really different from every other one. And it set me off trying to read as much as I could into the comedic tradition of literature across, novels and stories and essays and newspaper writing and whatever it might be. And that's where things often start for me with writing generally. A similar thing happened with the novel. I'd been reading a lot of P.G. Wodehouse, and I'll just read something and be so taken with it and so fascinated by it technically that I want to figure out how it works. Like the novels are like, Swiss watch or something. So you just want to figure out how it works mechanically. And I think it was something similar with essays and writers of these kinds, where I thought, wow, this looks so effortless and easy, but these voices are actually something that each of these writers had to put a lot of time and effort into refining.
I want to encourage everyone to put their questions in, because I think we're going till 8, right? Is that right? I want to leave room for questions, but I'm going to ask you a couple more, and then we'll switch it over to what the people want to know. Okay, so the excerpt you just read, and keeping that comedic voice that you were just speaking about, I think those things, especially that voice, it keeps everything that you've written feel really present and really true. When you're writing creative nonfiction, how far from the truth do you let yourself go, especially when you're doing dialogue exchanges or things like that, things like that happened. Can you talk about what those rules for you or those parameters are?
Yeah, I think that's a really great quality to pinpoint, because I think part of what I find funny, and maybe it's just a quality of comedy that feels surprising, is that it expresses something in a really, that what you said about being really present. It's like you're seeing it in a really new way, or expressed in a fresh way that can only really happen from not being kind of checked out. Like you have to be there really looking at things and experiencing them, I think, in a present way. I don't tend to drift very far from fact when writing, even though, when you're writing in a comedic voice and exaggeration is your friend, usually, there are, little ways of crafting a dialogue exchange that heighten something that is a fact and make it comic, not necessarily by changing what someone said, but usually for me, it has a lot to do with capturing the state of mind I was in when I heard that thing, or when I saw it. And I will do a lot of writing in nonfiction that is open about speculating. So, if I can't remember something really well, I'll say, I don't remember it really well, but it might have gone something like this to signal that I'm speculating a bit rather than just diving in and fully into invention. So I find that can be like a comic technique in the right context. Yeah.
Okay, guys, we're gonna switch over while I ask Evan to, he's heard me ask him this before, so it shouldn't be too surprising, but your two books, which are your two children, are hanging off the cliff. Which one are you gonna save? Because you can only save one, and the other one is unfortunately gonna perish. Can you let us know that? And I will start queuing up the next question.
It's so tragic. It's such a tragic situation. But I would rescue my novel. In part because I feel like it would sound so self-obsessed to save the book of essays that's about me. But I also think, and we've chatted about this a little bit before, I spent so much time writing the novel over an extended period of time. It felt like I learned how to write and was teaching myself how to write by writing it and stepping away and coming back to it and seeing what was there and thinking about it, changing it over and over and over again. And I had, for me, some of my, even to date, most formative experiences as a writer just working on the book. And I think it really helped me fall in love with writing because things can happen when you're working on something over a long period of time that are pretty magical. You'll have been working on a novel for 3 years, have written a few drafts, put it away in frustration. You'll go sit down and open it again half a year later, and it will be kind of like you had walked away from a garden and come back and all of these things had grown and there was fruit hanging off the boughs. So I had some experiences like that writing the novel that have been some of the most beautiful experiences of my life, honestly. So so unfortunately, the essay has to fall into the ravine off the cliff edge. Yeah.
Well, I'm sad that one has perished. I'm just kidding. Everything's fine. We have
Happens for a reason.
I'm going to move into our thank you for explaining that too. Especially it's encouraging to hear, keep writing, put it away, take it out again. Don't burn up anything. Don't burn it. Don't throw it away. Keep it, set it aside, come back to it.
Your devotion to your work and to your practice can teach you more than anything else.
Yeah. And that's, I think we're all trying to find out what that means for us, like each of us. We have our first question, which is a two-parter. And since you've already addressed the first one, your general structure and narrative planning, which is process-oriented, I'm going to move on to the second part of that question. And what was your approach to designing a story? This is about Cheer Up, Mr. Widdicombe, with 7 characters. How did you determine which ones to develop or give arcs to, and then how each of their stories interconnect?
Yeah, it was a really improvised process. I'm not someone who outlines successfully, or I should say this, I'll write and improvise my way into a draft, kind of create an outline of what I have, start again, the outline falls apart, I have to make a new outline. And so it's all really, really, really process driven for me. And I had never at any point sat down towards the beginning and thought, there will be 7 characters in this book. 4 will be major characters, 2 will be secondary characters, 1 will have a cameo. It was more a process of from draft to draft, rereading it and starting to see intuitively that in the context of what the book was revealing itself to be about, 3 or 4 characters were more important or meaningful than some of the others, which is I sort of like hurts me to say for some reason because I got to know those secondary characters so well. But I think once you get a little bit later on in the process and you're starting to think a lot more about architecture and structure, some of those choices start to naturally become more clear. You have to be willing to cut a lot of stuff and to change, how much of one element or another is present in the book. There are two characters, Marvelous and Gracie, in this book, who have a romance. And they had a much bigger role in earlier drafts. And I actually came really close to cutting them out completely, but then a reader of mine talked me talked me away from that ledge and explained through their eyes that these characters do have a role, and it's an important one. They reflect some of the concerns of the other characters, but you can accomplish that with less material about them. So yeah, there's a lot of trial and error in it.
And that's actually a really interesting thing to consider too. Like everyone needs to find readers to read their stuff and like to give that extra perspective. You may miss something like that. So that's good to know too. The next question, as a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, which subgenres of each are you drawn to and why?
I feel so naturally drawn to the novel. I don't totally understand why. Like I was saying about the short story earlier, I find it like wildly mysterious and difficult to write. I've actually started writing more short stories because I'm so intrigued by my own feeling about how difficult it is, and how little kind of understanding I have of it as a form. Although Deborah Eisenberg, the great short story writer, believes that like she doesn't believe that form exists. Some things are just short and long. In any event, I think I just really like having a big canvas to play around on, especially in the beginning. Um, when I'm in that phase of just splashing around and talking to myself and proliferating, the novel feels like a nicely capacious canvas for that. Yeah, and I think because of my interest in comedy also, it started to feel natural in nonfiction to gravitate towards things where the personal voice was pretty prominent. And so I think those are a couple things that inform, yeah, what I end up gravitating to in that way.
What next we're moving to back to your comedic voice. How do you keep the pacing steady throughout your books while maintaining the reader's emotional investment? How long do you stay within a moment, thought, beat, or scene? And how does it change from novel to essay?
Ooh, that's a really good question and a hard question. Um, yeah, I mean, I think timing and rhythm are really crucial elements of these questions, and that's one of those things. Again, so much trial and error, but I spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm dramatizing and what I'm summarizing because there's a natural, um, how do I want to put it? There's just a certain rhythm that emerges from moving between those two modes, and there can be something really, to me, inherently comedic, at least in the context of comedy, of you have a page of someone kind of totally absorbed in their inner world and in their mind and in their feelings, and then suddenly they're yanked out into scene. So I think a lot about that stuff and think about, is it funnier in this moment to go internal or to be out and kind of dancing around? Um, and for me, that applies across fiction and nonfiction, actually. Um, those are those questions that start to it never starts out that way exactly, and it takes a lot of refining, um, and revising and rewriting. And I think those are the things I start to think about a lot more when I have the full shape of the material and I'm thinking about structure and stuff. I'm also thinking about timing and yeah, yeah. Was that, did I answer the question?
I kind of led you into the comedy aspect of that to part two with another question, but also just because I think that is one of the uniting factors, at least between this novel and your collected essays, is your sense of comedy or satire. And then a follow-up, how do you learn what jokes and witty moments will land for readers? Also, the pacing of jokes, how do you create comedic timing inside of writing?
That's a really good question. I think I don't always know. I do think for me, part of it does come out of that really exploratory and process driven phase of writing because, and I think this applies whether it's comedy or whatever the like feeling or effect or sensation might be. um, I have found that moments that emerge from the writing that are really surprising to me and that I didn't plan and that feel unexpected and fresh or kind of throw me off guard, or where I've kind of delighted myself while I'm sitting and writing unexpectedly with some unanticipated turn of phrase or a funny situation. Usually, my experience is that if I've been sort of caught off guard and have an unplanned experience like that while I'm writing, it's felt by a reader and they may have a similar experience, no guarantee, but I have found that to be kind of a one reliable measure. Like there are certain things within the novel too that just felt particularly like, oh, I did not know that was going to come up, or that was really kind of a moment when I was writing and like laughed to myself because something really unusual emerged. And I've noticed that other readers have pointed out moments like that to me too.
So are you saying that you write a joke and even you don't know the punchline and you make yourself laugh? Is that
Yeah, I never know the punchline to anything. And I think there's worse things than I think it's fun to sit down and try to amuse yourself and to delight yourself. And it's pretty good practice for potentially finding, delightful things. Because then you're communicating a humor that is yours rather than like trying to create a calculated joke, you know?
Yeah. I definitely, and you can definitely feel that when you're reading either the collection or the book, your novel. One, I think we have, I'm not sure if we're ending right at 8. Are we ending right at 8? I don't know those. The
You could go longer if
if
you
you
Yeah.
can keep going. Sorry? I don't know who's
I'm happy to go on. Yeah.
Okay, if you guys have any more questions, throw them up. I have a few more for you. One of the when you're formatting a novel, like Mr. Widdicombe, and it does have so many POVs, did you find that, like, did you shift POVs sometimes in the middle of a scene, or you don't really necessarily do breaks and then move from one to the next? But I wasn't confused at all, like when I was reading this. So obviously whatever you're doing is working. Can you tell us what you're doing and why it works?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. POV, I feel like that was something I had to practice and practice a lot and learn a lot about through experimenting with it. Um, I think usually uh, one thing I figured out is that you have to spend enough time with one POV before switching to another that you feel fully absorbed in one, and you've arrived at kind of a moment that feels like a natural transition into somebody else's. I feel like I end up talking about this a lot in teaching you know, people approach it in lots of different ways. I think I think one of the things you're doing when you write a lot and rewrite and practice these things over and over again is you're training your instincts to know when the right moment is to make a transition from one thing to another. Yeah.
Thank you for telling us that. Again, it comes down to time, dedication, and practice, I suppose. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It was supposed to end 2 minutes ago. I want to thank everyone for coming, and Evan, I'm so pleased that you're here with us this evening, but also that you're part of our little JHU universe now. Everyone, please go read his books. You will not be disappointed. You'll probably want to make your own screen prints of many of the things for T-shirts and sayings and slogans. So thank you all. I had a great evening. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you all for coming.